Welcome to Industry Focus, the podcast that dives into a different sector of the stock market every single day. Today is Wednesday, September the 11th, and we're talking healthcare. Todd Campbell, healthcare guru, joining us via Skype. Todd, how you doing over there?
It's good that this is a healthcare show because I think I need some healthcare. I'm battling a cold, listeners. I apologize. I'm going to do my best here to get us through some interesting subject matter. Just bear with me a little bit.
Yes. And actually, Todd, I know you're under the weather today, but I'm hoping you'll feel better because we've got lots of good news for you to digest this week in the biotech space. You know, often we're talking about pipeline blowups, bad study results, all kind of craziness in the healthcare sector. So it's always nice to have a show where we've got some really good positive data coming out of the space. So with that, let's kick it off. I want to start with Acadia Pharmaceuticals. That's ticker symbol ACAD for our listeners out there. It's a commercial stage biotech that specializes in CNS, central nervous system disorders. Currently sports a market cap of about $5.9 billion. Stock is up 156% year to date this year, Todd. Pretty amazing, but that's really thanks to strong sales related to its bread and butter product, Nuplazid.
Is that all, Shannon? Is that all? It's only up 100?
That's it, just slightly. But, you know, there's been a lot of focus on Acadia Pharmaceuticals because the question has really been, can they expand beyond the one approval that they have for this drug, which is in psychosis related to Parkinson's disease? It's really kind of been a roller coaster, this ride, even though the stock is up quite a bit this year. It's been a roller coaster. But this week, I think the market opportunity ahead for Acadia Pharmaceuticals really started to clear a little bit, at least. Thanks to some positive interim study results, stock jumped 63% on the news surrounding what could be the next approval for Nuplazid. Todd, before we get into those study results, though, let's just start about what this drug means for Acadia Pharmaceuticals and what we saw with that strong second quarter.
Okay, so we did $83 million roughly in revenue in the second quarter. That was up 46% year over year. The company is now guiding for $320 to $330 million in sales this year. That would be up 45% at the midpoint. And I think it's important to realize that following that second quarter performance, you know, that up guidance, the prior guidance was $280 million to $300 million. So that's a substantial increase in guidance. And I think the reason that you saw so many investors just embrace the stock following this latest data is that you're talking about a massive expansion of the total addressable market. You mentioned the Parkinson's disease psychosis indication that it's already approved for. That represents 400,000 to 500,000 patients, roughly. So 40 to 50% of patients with Parkinson's disease. Data that they just reported that caused shares to soar, that total addressable market for dementia-related psychosis, that would include things like Alzheimer's disease, that is 1.2 million. So right there, you've gone from, you know, an addressable market of 400,000 to 500,000 patients to what, 1.6, 1.7 million?
Yeah, so pretty large market opportunity ahead. And I think what's really interesting about these study results is that they had a fail. I believe it was in adult schizophrenia back in July. So I think for a lot of investors, a lot of people have been watching this company, there wasn't a tremendous amount of hope in them being able to pull off any sort of positive news with this particular study. And so for the most part, this was pretty much a surprise. This was the Harmony trial that they actually sounds like they stopped early because of the positive results. And one of the things that they were looking at was defining what is called relapse in patients that have this psychosis. So it's really looking at hospitalization due to dementia-related psychosis. Did their symptoms deteriorate, withdrawing from the study due to lack of efficacy, and did they have to use any sort of antipsychotic medications? For this larger market opportunity that they do have ahead, just one thing to note, like, granted, it's a larger market opportunity, but you do have a lot of these antipsychotics, many of which are generic. So even though it's a bigger market opportunity, it's also still somewhat of a competitive, crowded market space too.
Yeah, $36,000 to $40,000 a year is roughly what Nuplazid's list price is. And obviously with discounts and stuff, it's probably not costing that much. So some of these antipsychotics are more of a value, I suppose. And if they're working for a patient, sure, keep them on that. But for many patients, it's not it doesn't work well. And,
Exactly.
Sometimes it can increase the cognitive decline of these dementia patients. So my assumption would be we're going to get more data later in the year at a conference. Once we look through all that data, my assumption would be is if it looks good and they get approval, that yes, you're going to see sales of this drug take off from 2020 through 2021 on this just from having the label expanded to include this indication. You mentioned the schizophrenia headwind, the trial that failed earlier this year. It didn't improve the good symptoms, if you will, but they still have some hope that maybe it would improve bad symptoms or make them less worse, I suppose. And there's a phase 2 trial that will read out later this year in that indication. So investors should realize there is some more data coming later in the year that could also move the stock up or down.
Exactly. And that particular trial, I think that's set to read out potentially in December. And they're looking at specifically negative symptoms, as you were alluding to, Todd. So things like loss of interest, emotional withdrawal, cognitive impairment, things like that. Studies do show that about 40 to 50% of schizophrenia patients do experience these negative symptoms. So this is an opportunity to watch. Another one that I'm watching, they've also have a drug. So they're not trying to be a one-trick pony with Nuplazid, but there is another late-stage study of a drug called trofinetide, I believe is how it's pronounced, in treating Rett syndrome. Rett syndrome is basically a rare disease, neurodevelopmental disorder that occurs predominantly in females. Right now, there are no approved treatments in this particular patient class, but that's another market opportunity of another 6,000 to 9,000 patients. They've also got late-stage testing as a supplemental treatment for Nuplazid in patients with major depressive disorder as well. So all in all, I mean, you've got a lot to look forward to. There's some estimates now that Acadia could hit $1 billion in sales by 2023. So I think a lot of the people that have either been on the sidelines or have kind of turned a blind eye, all of a sudden there's this renewed focus in a company that could have some really, really interesting market opportunities ahead.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of short covering that drove a lot of that big jump. A lot of people were betting against the ability to expand this into other indications, and they were proven wrong. And I think that one of the things as investors we have to think about, okay, you mentioned a $6 billion market cap, and then you also said 2023 sales estimates of about $1 billion. So you're already trading at 6 to roughly times 2023 sales. So this is not a cheap stock. I think investors might want to just sort of sit back, see how these other trials play out, especially in the depressive disorder, because that's a 2.5 million patient population. So.
Yeah, totally agree, Todd. I think another thing, too, in the near term to be watching out for, Acadia did end the most recent quarter with $382 million in cash, but they burned through about $140 million just in the first half of this year. So I do anticipate they'll be tapping secondary markets here pretty soon. But I think all in all, this is one that I'll be watching, especially for some of these late-stage trials heading into the latter part of this year. Let's talk about the other big pharma player making news, and that is Eli Lilly, ticker symbol LLY, which recently acquired Loxo Oncology for about $8 billion earlier this year. The largest deal the biopharma player has made to date. In the most recent study reported out of the World Conference on Lung Cancer in Barcelona, seems to be pointing toward Lilly making the right call on Loxo, although that price tag is still to be debated. But the drug that's turning heads, mine included, is oral drug Loxo 292, now referred to as selpercatinib. We'll just call it Loxo 292.
Can we just, yeah, please.
But Todd, this is a drug and a company we've talked about on the show before. I was impressed the last time we were diving into their study results, and honestly continue to be more and more impressed with this company, especially as we're headed into this age of precision medicine and gene-targeted cancer drugs. But can you give us just a quick, brief overview? What exactly is Loxo 292, and what did we see?
Well, Lilly wants to expand into oncology. Oncology is obviously a very big market, and it's growing because of an aging, larger population. And, Loxo is very intriguing because it's one of the first to have come out with precision medicines that specifically go after genetic mutations and those kind of targets. So not really thinking about cancer as far as where did it originate, such as in the lung, but thinking more what is the genetic mutation that is actually driving that cancer to form. And what's interesting about Loxo, and probably why Lilly paid so much money for it, is it already got its first drug across the finish line last November. The FDA approved Victracvi, which is a TRK fusion gene drug that targets 12 different cancers. Sales aren't big yet, and they have to share. They only collect royalties because Bayer licensed the rights to that drug. But it obviously proved that their platform was strong and would be able to generate other, theoretically, of these precision medicines. Now we're starting to see that bear fruit with Loxo 292, which targets the RET gene mutation. And RET gene mutations aren't very common. They do occur at about 2% of non-small cell lung cancer cases, and then in a slightly higher proportion of thyroid cancer patients. And, I broke out the math on that, and that's about, I want to say 4,000 to 5,000 per year patients in lung cancer, and maybe 1,000 to 2,000 per year in thyroid cancer.
Yeah, and so this particular study, it's named Libretto 001. It is the largest trial ever reported in RET-altered cancer patients thus far. And just from a high level, basically RET fusion drives what's called oncogenesis, where basically healthy cells become transformed into cancer cells. So just taking a look at the results, pretty impressive to start. 68% of 105 patients, all of whom had actually failed previous treatments, including chemo, saw a response after taking the drug. That basically meant that their tumors decreased in size by at least 30%. So that was certainly a check. But then it got better, Todd. In the 34 patients who had not been previously treated, the response rate was actually 85%. But it didn't stop there. In those patients whose cancer had actually spread to their brains or their central nervous system, the response rate was 91%. On top of all of that, the responses were actually durable. They lasted for a median of 20.3 months with progression-free survival of 18.4 months. And that is something we should see continue to improve because the majority of the patients continue to respond to treatment or are progression-free as of the cutoff, which I believe was in June. Across the board, we saw some really impressive response rates for this drug.
Absolutely. This is theoretically game-changing and life-saving for patients with this particular mutation. And the data is, supports the idea that, Lilly can go out and file for FDA approval of this. The big question in my eyes, or in my mind, I'm wondering, is whether or not it will get approved for later line therapy. So you'll have to go through the platinum-containing chemotherapy first, or if you'll be able to get an approval based on this trial in the treatment naive. I don't know whether or not there were enough patients in treatment naive to be able to justify an approval in that. We didn't have progression-free survival as a primary endpoint. We don't have overall survival as a primary endpoint. But overall response rates that high, very, very encouraging. And also encouraging is the fact that on the safety profile of this drug looks very good. I think that they said the discontinuation rate was only 1.7%.
Yeah, very small. And even when it came to side effects, you're talking about dry mouth, diarrhea, constipation. So very much at the lower end of the severity range when it comes to side effects. So another notch for them. I think right now Lilly plans to file for approval by the end of the year. This certainly gives Eli Lilly a chance to offset some of the revenue due to patent expirations and competition. So needless to say, all eyes will be on this drug. They are also, of course, looking at this drug in thyroid cancer. We should get results in that indication, updates at the end of the year. And this is basically 10 to 20% of papillary and other thyroid cancers have this same type of mutation as well. And then, as impressive as that is, though, they are not the only players in this space because you've also got Blueprint Medicines, and that's ticker symbol BPMC. Todd, you and I have talked about this on the show, but their drug, Blue 667, it had a 60% response rate in the same indication. they're going to be reading out soon. So granted, I think for Lilly and Loxo, first to market, first with this type of mechanism of action, but Blueprint is going to be right on their heels.
Yeah, I think that obviously investors are going to have to, bear that amount, especially when you're looking at Blueprint. I mean, this isn't going to move the needle for Lilly. Lilly's a huge company, and I don't know if this is necessarily a blockbuster drug. I mean, it'll be a high-priced drug, but I don't know if it'll be a blockbuster. The data on the surface does appear to give Loxo/Lilly an advantage over Blueprint, but when you're talking about this size of patient population, I'm not going to quibble too much between a 60% overall response rate and a 68% overall response rate. We'll have to see how the safety comes out. Did look like maybe more patients had discontinued treatment in the Blueprint trial as of the last update, but too early to call on that.
Exactly. Too early to call. And they do plan to do a randomized study comparing the drug to standard chemo as a first treatment in lung cancer. So I can tell you all eyes will be on that. Another thing that I think is worth watching, we did get some updates recently, is because this occurs in such a small percentage of the population. I think you said, 1 to 2%, Todd?
Correct.
It's the challenge then becomes for Eli Lilly being able to identify these patients that will be able to respond. Thermo Fisher did recently announce that it's going to have a companion diagnostic tool to go along with this. So I think that will certainly help, but that's another area that I'll be keeping a close eye on as well.
Absolutely agree with you.
Yeah. So with that will close us out. But I do want to let you know a company that we've talked about before, one that I know many of you are watching, Immune Therapeutics. They just had FDA briefing docs for their peanut allergy drug just dropped today. They're going to have an FDA advisory committee meeting on Friday, the 13th. Dun, dun, dun. So we'll see how that goes. Overall, briefing docs look very, very pretty much benign. Nothing too outrageous. But as we know, as biotech investors, anything can happen in those FDA advisory committee meetings. Todd, I don't know about you. I plan to watch this only because it's the first of what will hopefully be many.
Absolutely going to watch this, pay attention to it, and hopefully talk about it soon on the show, right, Shannon?
That's right. You got it. So yes, be sure to check us out next week because we will keep you up to date on all the latest happening with that particular company and more. But as for us, that'll do it for Industry Focus Healthcare. We want to thank you for tuning in. As always, people on the program may have interest in the companies discussed on the show, and the Motley Fool may have formal recommendations for or against. So don't buy or sell anything based solely on what you hear. Thanks to Dan Boyd for his work behind the glass today. For Todd Campbell, I'm Shannon Jones. Thanks for listening, and Full On.